The White House is designed to absorb chaos. Staff are trained for crisis. Presidents forget names, stumble over sentences, snap at reporters, exaggerate victories, tell awkward jokes that land badly. Washington has seen all of it before. The system survives because everyone around the president knows how to keep moving when the cameras are rolling. But what unfolded inside the Oval Office during Donald Trump's meeting with the Artemis astronauts felt different. Because for a few long minutes, the room stopped looking like a room full of professionals managing political chaos and started looking like a room full of people quietly wondering whether the President of the United States was losing control in real time. And the most disturbing part was not Donald Trump himself. It was the faces behind him. The astronauts standing there had spent years preparing for deep space missions, psychological testing, survival simulations, stress conditioning. These are people trained to remain calm while sitting on top of millions of pounds of explosive fuel. Yet during this White House appearance they looked frozen, not inspired, not proud, frozen. Because instead of discussing Artemis, NASA, or the future of American space exploration, Donald Trump became fixated on the physical appearance of the NASA administrator, specifically his ears. You heard that question with those beautiful ears of yours. He's got super hearing. Great ears. At first, a few people smiled politely, the way people do when they assume an awkward moment will quickly pass. But it did not pass. Trump kept returning to it, again and again, like a man completely disconnected from the atmosphere inside the room. The astronauts exchanged glances. Reporters stared down at their notes. The smiles tightened. Nobody wanted to react too honestly on camera because everybody instinctively understood the danger of the moment. Once you admit something feels wrong, you cannot unsee it afterward. And that is the real story here. Not a bad joke. Not another Trump being Trump moment. This has become a question about observable cognitive behavior inside the most powerful office on Earth. Because what happened next made the situation even harder to dismiss. During the same public appearance, Donald Trump repeatedly confused Iran and Ukraine while discussing military conflicts, NATO involvement, and global security issues. Not once, repeatedly, he referred to military actions connected to Iran while saying Ukraine. He shifted between geopolitical theaters as though the wars were interchangeable. He spoke about NATO in ways that suggested either profound confusion or complete detachment from basic facts surrounding one of the largest international conflicts in modern history. And nobody corrected him publicly. Think about that for a second. The President of the United States appeared unable to consistently separate two massively important geopolitical crises involving nuclear powers, energy markets, proxy wars, NATO coordination, and American military strategy, and the room simply kept moving forward like airport staff pretending not to notice smoke coming from the cockpit. Then came the moment that should have set off alarms far beyond Washington media circles. Standing beside elite astronauts who passed some of the most rigorous physical screening standards in the world, Donald Trump began talking about how he himself could probably qualify as an astronaut because he was, in his words, physically very good. And he did not sound like he was joking. Because if it were a joke, there would have been signals, a smirk, a pause, a wink to the room, some acknowledgement that the statement was intentionally absurd. But Donald Trump delivered it with the same sincerity people use when discussing blood pressure readings or retirement plans. He genuinely appeared to believe that standing next to astronauts somehow reinforced his own image as a man in peak physical condition. And that detail matters more than people realize because grandiosity by itself is not new with Trump. What is new is the growing inability to distinguish between performance and reality. That distinction is everything. A politically theatrical figure understands the role he is playing. He exaggerates intentionally, he manipulates attention deliberately, but when someone begins speaking as though the fantasy version of themselves is literally true, especially while displaying visible confusion and social disinhibition at the same time, the situation changes completely. Now you are no longer dealing with branding, you are dealing with cognition, and the evidence keeps stacking. After the Oval Office event, clips resurfaced showing Donald Trump discussing a recent Supreme Court ruling involving Louisiana and the Voting Rights Act. This was not some obscure procedural issue buried inside legal academia. The ruling carried massive implications for congressional districts, minority voting power, and election law nationwide. Any president actively governing the country should have been capable of articulating even a basic understanding of the decision. Instead, Trump drifted into vague filler language saying he understood the concepts of the ruling. The concepts. That phrase landed like a fire alarm for legal analysts because it sounded exactly like someone bluffing their way through material they had not processed, not discussing the ruling, not discussing constitutional implications, not discussing dissenting opinions or federal standards, just the concepts. It sounded like a student trying to survive a book report after never opening the book. Except this was not a classroom embarrassment. This was the commander-in-chief discussing constitutional law while standing in front of cameras watched by allies, adversaries, intelligence agencies, military officials, and financial markets around the world. And then came the phone call with Vladimir Putin, an hour and a half. Initially hidden until Russian media forced acknowledgement that it even happened. That detail alone should have triggered far more scrutiny than it received. Because once the call became public, Trump emerged visibly disorganized during subsequent remarks, once again confusing Iran and Ukraine while discussing military operations and international responses. Imagine an airline pilot mixing up New York and Tokyo while describing emergency landing coordinates. Nobody would say, well, everybody misspeaks sometimes. They would pull the pilot out of the cockpit immediately because precision under pressure is the entire job. The presidency operates under infinitely higher stakes. This is the individual responsible for nuclear command authority, military escalation decisions, intelligence briefings, diplomatic crises, and rapid response judgment during international emergencies. Yet what the public keeps witnessing is a pattern: confusion followed by deflection, factual errors followed by improvisation, bizarre commentary followed by aides pretending the bizarre commentary never happened. And maybe the clearest warning sign of all is this: Donald Trump increasingly appears unable to recognize when other people are uncomfortable around him. Watch the footage carefully. The astronauts are not reacting like people hearing edgy political humor. They are reacting like hospital staff trying not to panic while a patient says something alarming in the middle of an evaluation. Tight shoulders, frozen expressions, quick side glances. Nobody knows whether to laugh because nobody knows whether the president understands how strange he sounds anymore. That is not normal political tension. That is social deterioration unfolding in public view. And this is where the story stops being about awkward television clips and starts becoming something much darker, because cognitive decline inside ordinary life is tragic. But cognitive decline attached to presidential power becomes a national security issue. A grandfather forgetting names at Thanksgiving is painful. A president confusing active geopolitical conflicts while controlling the most advanced military apparatus on Earth is something else entirely. The scale changes the meaning. The stakes transform the sympathy into fear, especially when the behavior does not end once the cameras leave the Oval Office, because some of the most disturbing material now comes after midnight. While most White House staff are asleep, while diplomats overseas are monitoring conflict zones, while military personnel rotate through overnight watch schedules, Donald Trump has increasingly turned the early morning hours into a stream of erratic social media activity. 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, posts written with the emotional volatility of someone spiraling deeper into obsession instead of winding down into rest, conspiracy memes, rage posts, delusional self-mythologizing, messages that read less like presidential communication and more like a man alone in a room arguing with invisible enemies. And then came the 8647 post. This was the moment the many observers stopped using the word embarrassing and started using the word dangerous, because Donald Trump did not simply insult James Comey, he posted language widely associated with organized crime terminology. 86 has long been understood in criminal slang as a reference to eliminating someone, making them disappear, removing them permanently. Trump then amplified the phrase 8647, explaining it as 8 miles out, 6 feet down, a burial reference directed toward a former FBI director with whom he has maintained a years-long personal vendetta. Think about how insane that sentence would have sounded 10 years ago. The President of the United States posting what many interpreted as mob-style coded language implying violence against a former federal law enforcement official in the middle of the night, while aides and political allies scrambled afterward to downplay it as humor or trolling or sarcasm or just Trump being Trump. That phrase again, the most dangerous phrase in modern American politics. Just Trump being Trump. It has become the institutional sedative used every time behavior crosses another line. Every escalation gets normalized through repetition. Every alarming moment gets converted into content. Every breach of presidential conduct becomes another clip in the endless entertainment cycle until the public loses the ability to distinguish between scandal and systemic breakdown. But here is the prosecutorial question nobody inside Trump's orbit once asked directly. What happens when the pattern itself becomes the evidence? Because isolated incidents can be dismissed, patterns cannot. The confusion between Iran and Ukraine was not isolated. The bizarre fixation on physical appearance was not isolated. The grandiose claims about astronaut-level fitness were not isolated. The late-night social media eruptions were not isolated. The increasingly detached language, the inability to read social discomfort, the impulsive verbal wandering, the obsession with personal enemies, the inflated self-image detached from visible reality, these are not random dots floating separately in space anymore. They form a behavioral trajectory. And even members of Trump's own family have begun quietly acknowledging it. Mary Trump, a trained psychologist and Donald Trump's niece, has publicly warned for years about what she describes as accelerating psychological instability and cognitive deterioration. Fred Trump III has raised concerns of his own. Now, family testimony alone does not prove a medical diagnosis. It should not. But when close relatives who spent decades around the same individual begin describing worsening confusion, intensified grandiosity, and emotional instability at the exact same moment the public is witnessing increasingly erratic behavior on camera, dismissing all of it as coincidence starts becoming intellectually dishonest. And meanwhile, the rest of the world is watching this unfold in real time. Not just allies, adversaries. And some of those adversaries are no longer even bothering to hide their mockery. Iranian state-linked social media accounts have openly ridiculed Donald Trump's overnight posting habits, telling the President of the United States to go to sleep, joking about nightmares, joking about instability, joking about exhaustion. Think about the geopolitical humiliation buried inside that image for a second. One of America's primary foreign policy rivals no longer needs sophisticated anti-American propaganda. They can simply repost Trump's own midnight messages and let the spectacle speak for itself. That is where this story becomes bigger than Donald Trump. Because the true scandal is not merely that the president may be deteriorating publicly, the true scandal is the machinery surrounding him pretending the deterioration is invisible. The White House physicians continue releasing glowing health summaries that read less like medical evaluations and more like campaign brochures. Political allies continue reframing every bizarre moment as comedic genius. Media surrogates continue insisting confusion is strategy, incoherence is authenticity, impulsiveness is strength. The entire ecosystem has become invested in protecting the image even when the image is visibly collapsing in front of them. And history has seen this before. Not necessarily with Trump specifically, but with systems so addicted to preserving authority that they begin treating obvious reality as the true threat. Because once institutions admit the emperor may no longer be fully capable, panic spreads outward instantly, markets react, allies recalibrate, enemies test boundaries, political careers implode. So instead, everyone around the problem learns to adapt to the problem. They shorten briefings. They redirect conversations, they clean up statements afterward, they normalize behavior that would have triggered emergency concern under any ordinary circumstance. That is what makes the astronauts' reaction so haunting in retrospect. Those men and women looked like people witnessing something they knew they were not supposed to acknowledge publicly. They stood there smiling the same way passengers smile at turbulence when they can see fear spreading across the flight attendants' faces. Because human beings instinctively understand social disintegration before they intellectually process it. The room knew before the headlines did. And maybe that is the most chilling detail of all. Nobody truly looked surprised. Uncomfortable? Yes. Embarrassed? Absolutely. But surprised? No. That suggests something even worse than a single alarming appearance. It suggests repetition, familiarity, pattern recognition behind closed doors. Because if this Oval Office moment genuinely shocked White House staff, their reactions would have looked different. Instead, many of them looked like people enduring something they had already learned how to survive. Which brings us to the real constitutional question underneath all of this. What happens when a political system becomes so polarized, so tribal, so addicted to power preservation that obvious behavioral warning signs stop mattering? What happens when supporters no longer ask whether the person holding authority is capable of exercising it responsibly, but only whether acknowledging the problem might hurt their side politically? At that point, democracy itself starts entering dangerous territory because the standard quietly changes from competence to loyalty. And that is how institutions erode, not through explosions, not through tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue, but through normalization, through silence, through millions of people watching increasingly alarming behavior unfold in plain sight, while convincing themselves that reacting honestly would somehow be more dangerous than the behavior itself. So, judge the footage for yourself. Watch Donald Trump confuse wars, ramble through legal issues he appears not to understand, obsess over physical appearance in front of astronauts, post cryptic late-night threats, and drift through moments of visible confusion while the people around him stare into the floor pretending everything is normal. Then ask yourself one simple question. If this behavior came from anyone else on Earth entrusted with nuclear authority, would the system still be pretending not to see it? And if you believe accountability should apply to power no matter who holds it, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe.